The story begins with a girl pondering the question of when her life took a wrong turn. At first, she thought it happened on the day she was born an orphan. Then the girl decided that perhaps her life had taken a wrong turn on the day when her boss, to whom she had sworn to devote her entire life, betrayed her and tried to kill her. Or perhaps it happened when the wish she made in the last moments of her life came true, and she was reborn as a child of a noble, aristocratic family just before her death. The little girl was suffering from a high fever, and all the maids were running around her trying to help. One of them begged the girl to hold on a little longer until the doctor arrived. But the man angrily shouted that he had no time for all these ailments and that they had to deal with it themselves. The man angrily exclaimed that the girl could not even die with dignity. The man's voice sounded familiar to the girl, and when she recognized him, a chill ran down her spine because she realized that she had been reborn into the family of the man who had wanted to kill her in her previous life. The next morning, the girl decided to take a walk and immediately met Mary, the maid. She called the girl Irene and asked what the little lady was doing there. The maid remarked that the girl should not move around so much yet. Irene immediately asked why she no longer felt the excruciating pain she had felt yesterday, and why she could now run around the house without any problems. But Mary did not even want to see the little girl jumping around without rest, so she gently picked her up and told her that she should not rush into such excessive physical activity. The maid pointed out that even though her temperature had dropped, she shouldn't tempt fate, as she was seriously afraid that the fever could return, so she advised Irene to spend the day in bed. The girl was reborn into the Bruno family, where she worked as Harvenick's secretary until her death. Fate once again bound the girl to this place. Irene noticed the portrait of the late Duke Raphael. The fact that the portrait of the late Duke still hung on the wall made it clear that the eldest son had not yet inherited his father's title. It was around this time that his secretary, who was the girl in her past life, was supposed to come to work. All three of Harvenick's sons were problematic, and he was hesitant about who to give his title to. The middle son had renounced his family to marry a woman of low birth and had died 2 years earlier. The youngest son was never seen on the estate because he led a reclusive life. The eldest son, Harvenick, was ultimately the only one who could achieve success, so he inherited the title. When Harvenick was sure that he would inherit the title, he immediately began to secretly commit crimes. He entrusted some of these crimes to his secretary, namely money laundering and corruption. The girl gave her all. In the end, Harvenick simply took all the fruits of his secretary's labor and ruthlessly killed her. During her 10 years as a secretary, the girl had seen many murders, but she never thought she would become a victim of one. In her past life, the girl believed that if she devoted her entire life to the Brunel family, they would surely appreciate her efforts and she would be rewarded. Therefore, the girl worked tirelessly. The girl's previous life ended at a resort overlooking the sea. It was a quiet place, and the girl hoped to enjoy the peace and quiet, but it also meant that if she called for help, no one would hear her. That is why this place was ideal for murder. The girl begged for mercy, but no one listened to her, and so she met her last day of life in complete solitude. She had no friends, no lover, no family, and not even a home to return to. Lying on the seashore in a pool of blood, the girl felt her body finally giving up its last breath. The little girl was torn from her thoughts by her maid, who said she was very glad that the girl was feeling better. Mary said that she had spent the whole night praying for Irene to survive. Mary smiled and said that she wasn't sure if it was the prayers that had helped, but she really wanted to believe it. Tears welled up in Irene's eyes because her maid cared so much about her. Mary said that today she would bring the girl some treats, just like in the good old days, and asked Irene what she would like: milk, raspberries, or cookies. This selection seemed quite familiar to the girl. Then she realized that this was what the servants used to snack on. She herself had enjoyed such a treat many times in her past life. So, not wanting to take the treats away from the servants, she said she didn't want anything sweet. The maid found Irene's refusal rather suspicious, but she replied that when the girl was merry, she always brought her something tasty. The girl remembered that Irene had always been treated badly in her family. This was because Irene was the daughter of the middle son of the Duke of Brunoy, who had renounced his family for a commoner. Because of this, the girl was never treated properly. When the middle son and his wife died, the girl was sent to the Brunoy estate, and Mary was assigned to her as a personal maid. Only this girl truly loved the little girl. Irene's room resembled a storage room, and her food was no different from that of the servants. Therefore, the girl became convinced that no one treated the Duke's granddaughter as an equal member of the family. Harvenick simply hated this annoying girl, although he was forced to adopt her the very year she got a job here as a secretary. But by the time the secretary arrived at the estate, Irene had already died in an accident. Although it was said to be an accidental fall, none of the servants truly believed this version of events. The girl knew from her own experience that even though she was dying of fever, Harvenick was still angry with her because he didn't want to be bothered with such trifles. She thought that Harvenick had probably adopted Irene only to gain the approval of the Duke and obtain the title of heir. But the girl was useless and caused Harvenick nothing but trouble. Therefore, the girl decided that if things continued in the same vein, Harvenick would soon adopt her and then mercilessly kill her again without giving her the slightest chance of escape. The girl thought that there must be some reason why she was reborn as Irene Brunua, and that it might be some kind of divine message calling her to atone for the sins of her past life. Irene understood that this life would not be easy either, but she still had to do what she had always done in her life: fight with all her might to survive. To prevent her imminent death at the hands of Harvenick, the girl decided to do everything in her power to prevent him from adopting her. First, the girl decided to visit the Bruno family library. Erin was sure that here she would find answers to all her questions in the books she needed. The library was located in a separate building next to the main family estate. The library was quite large and gave a real sense of the power and wealth of the Duke's family. The reason the girl came to the library was to find literature on magical science. This was a field of research that scientifically studied the magical power contained in certain instruments and stones. Thanks to their research, magical scientists invented many tools that helped in everyday life. This allowed the empire to develop the richest civilization. However, magical tools required a significant amount of magical stones, and their supply was constantly decreasing. Everyone said that if you didn't have money, studying magic was not for you. The Brunua family belonged to a well-known aristocratic family in the empire, so money was not a problem for them. Of course, Irene knew this, so she went in search of magical literature. Magical science was the only thing that interested the man whom the girl saw as a potential father. The girl was intrigued by the magical calculations scattered on the table and decided to read them. Irene was so focused on the interesting calculations that she didn't notice a young man rush into the library and shout at her to get away immediately, rushing past her. Geoffrey Bruno was the youngest son of the Duke, whom everyone called a mad magical scientist. He did not communicate with anyone in the main mansion and spent all his time locked in his laboratory. Geoffrey was not interested in anything except magical science. And although everyone thought he was a little eccentric and not quite right in the head, Irene decided that he would be much better than Harvenick. She saw him as her future father because he definitely did not give the impression of someone capable of murder. Irene timidly greeted Geoffrey, but he shouted at her to put the papers with her calculations back where they belonged and not to get under his feet and to leave the library immediately. The girl was a little scared and said she would do everything right away. Sitting down at the farthest table, Irene realized with a sense of doom that Jeffrey was very jealous of his belongings, and she, forgetting this, had taken his research diary. The girl was upset because she had hoped to impress Jeffrey, but instead, she had already made a mistake in the first few minutes. Now she couldn't count on his sympathy. Then Irene pulled herself together and began to think about what she had seen in his diary. Simple numbers and symbols that looked like Elfram's magic formula. The girl knew that Elfram was a magic formula that, before her rebirth, had been considered revolutionary in the field of magical science. With its help, it was possible to create magical tools using a small number of stones. This formula was created in the Bruneau family library. Harvenick took all the credit for its creation in his past life. He was incredibly proud that the Bruneau family had become rich thanks to his discovery. The girl suspected that Harvenick had stolen Jeffrey's research and wanted to tell Jeffrey that his formula would become an incredibly important discovery in just a few years. Irene really wanted to tell Jeffrey that he couldn't let Harvenick steal the formula. She was more than sure that this scientist was not interested in financial gain and that only scientific research was on his mind. Irene kept her eyes on Jeffrey, who was starting to get nervous that something was wrong with his mathematical calculations. She really wanted to take a closer look at what was going on. After thinking for a moment, Irene realized that Jeffrey was probably stuck at some stage of the formula and couldn't figure out where he had gone wrong. So she approached him and timidly addressed the man. The girl apologized and wanted to say something, but Jeffrey was focused on his calculations and, snatching the page of his diary from her hands, continued to pore over his research. Irene was naturally offended that no one was paying attention to her, but she had no intention of giving up. So she approached him and, apologizing even louder, said she had something to say. Jeffrey looked angrily at Irene, who was starting to get on his nerves, and was about to yell at her, but the girl shouted loudly that he had made a mistake in his calculations. Jeffrey had no intention of listening to comments from some brat, so he banged his fist on the table and told her to mind her own business, because she didn't know anything about it. Irene understood why Jeffrey was so angry, but she decided to help him with his discovery, so she shouted that he had made mistakes in at least 3 places. Having said that, the girl turned around and ran out of the library as fast as she could, because she was very afraid that Jeffrey might get so angry that he would lose control and hit Irene. Irene ran to her room and fell onto her bed. She no longer dreamed that Jeffrey would become her father, because she was sure that she could not have made a worse impression on him. At first, Irene decided to run away from the estate, but when she took a realistic look at her belongings, she realized that it would be impossible for a little girl to survive on her own. So she decided to go to the library and apologize to Jeffrey. Irene also hoped to retrieve the books she had left behind yesterday because of the incident. But when she pulled the door handle and opened the door, she saw Jeffrey standing in the doorway. He was so nervous and angry that Irene instinctively covered her face with her hands, expecting the man to start beating her. She was about to call her maid for help, but Jeffrey showed her the magical calculations, on which 3 places were circled in red pencil, and shouted, asking if these were the places she had told him about yesterday. The girl looked closely at the calculations and nodded, agreeing with his hypothesis. She knew exactly where the mistakes were, but she didn't understand why he was asking her about it. After receiving the girl's answer, Jeffrey nervously asked her when she had started sticking her nose into his research and who had allowed her to check his calculations. Irene began to justify herself, explaining that she had only learned about his research yesterday. But Jeffrey asked irritably if he was supposed to believe that. The man asked haughtily if she really meant that she had noticed these mistakes in such a short period of time, because these were not the kind of calculations that could be understood just by glancing at them. Irene thought that Jeffrey obviously didn't believe her and said that she was good at math. He asked in surprise if she knew the equations and advanced formulas used in magic techniques. The The girl assured him that she knew all these equations, and if he didn't believe her, he could test her. This idea seemed quite reasonable to Jeffrey, and he laid out several calculations in front of the girl. Jeffrey suggested checking the calculations for errors. Irene was quite knowledgeable about magic formulas, and even though she had been reborn as a little girl, her knowledge had miraculously remained in her head. Irene began to lay out the mathematical calculations one by one, pointing out which ones had errors. Jeffrey initially thought it was a coincidence and gave her more and more magic formulas. But when the girl made no mistakes in the proposed tasks, he looked at Irene in amazement and said that it was simply incredible that she was able to solve all of this in her head. In her past life, the girl was one of the best in the orphanage, and this is what brought her the patronage of the Bruneau family, who decided to hire her as a secretary. The girl had always been confident in her ability to work with numbers and could solve calculations in magical formulas, even with her eyes closed, which was exactly what she needed right now. Jeffrey began to think aloud about how the girl could calculate such complex formulas at lightning speed in her mind, and how he could use her help to understand his magic programs. Then the man asked her how old she was, and when she replied that she was 7, he remarked that she was quite young. Then he invited Irene to visit him that afternoon. Irene was very surprised, and when Jeffrey started to leave, she asked if she should come to the library. The man quickly replied that he had invited her to his science lab. The surprised girl asked why. Jeffrey replied curtly that from now on, she would be his assistant. This statement surprised Irene even more, as she had been hoping for a parental relationship, not a business one. Jeffrey said that he had things to teach her, so she should hurry to the laboratory to prepare for the meeting. Then he turned around and suddenly asked Irene what she liked. It was so unexpected that Irene couldn't understand what he meant. Then Jeffrey asked if she had a favorite treat. Of course, she loved all kinds of desserts, but she didn't have any money for them in her past life. So she quietly said that she liked cookies. Jeffrey was surprised and asked if he had heard her correctly. Only then did he look at her in a completely different way. Irene felt that this man saw something valuable in her, and so she began to hope that they could become friends. A few hours later, the girl stood at the door of Jeffrey's laboratory and didn't understand why she was so nervous. She was scared by the mere thought that this genius had offered her to become his assistant. She was worried that she would work tirelessly for Jeffrey, and then Harvnik would eventually adopt her and beat her again. Still, she decided to take a chance to change her fate and knocked on the door. When the girl heard Jeffrey shout for her to come in, Irene boldly opened the door and peeked inside. It was a fairly spacious laboratory, with Jeffrey bustling about at his desk in the back. The laboratory was surprisingly clean, which surprised the girl because Jeffrey always looked rather clumsy, and she thought that his laboratory would be cluttered with junk. Jeffrey invited the girl to sit down at her workstation, pointing to a small table. He remarked that the butler hadn't had time to prepare anything better and that next time they would find something bigger. Jeffrey told the girl to wait until he had finished what he was doing and advised her to help herself to what he had prepared for her. Irene noticed a tray on the table. Irene immediately decided to take advantage of his offer and slightly opened the lid at the edge. Cookies were visible at the edge, and she was delighted that he had listened to her wishes. But when she opened the tray completely, she was speechless, because in front of her lay a very appetizing cake with whipped cream and strawberries. The girl was so surprised that she asked Jeffrey if she could eat the dessert, and when he said yes, she thanked him for this incredible treat. Taking the first bite, Irene felt like she was in heaven, because she had never tasted such a perfect combination of flavors in her life. She couldn't stop until the plate was empty. After such a dessert, Jeffrey seemed completely different to the girl. And although everyone considered him rude and unsociable, today, for Irene, he was the best man on earth. Jeffrey looked closely at the girl and asked if she was full. Irene replied that she had never tasted anything more delicious than this strawberry biscuit in her life. Jeffrey told the girl to wipe her mouth before speaking. Then Irene, seeing her reflection in the iron tray, noticed that she was covered in cream. Jeffrey said that if she worked hard, she would always get treats. Irene noticed that he was embarrassed and asked if he had made the dessert himself. The man replied that he was just very picky about food. To Irene, he seemed like a real god, who not only understood mathematical formulas, but also baked such delicious desserts. Jeffrey said that they should not be distracted by idle talk and told the girl to follow him and that he would tell her what to do later. They headed to the library, and the man handed her a book on magic, written by himself. Jeffrey proudly announced that there was no better book in the entire empire and added that he did not give it to just anyone. Jeffrey noted that now they were completely ready to work after restoring their energy. Noticing Irene's surprised look, he explained that scientists need glucose to work better. Now, the girl understood why Jeffrey had been so concerned about her dessert and realized that it was simply necessary for the energy he hoped to get from her while she worked. Jeffrey then placed a pile of mathematical calculations on Irene's desk and told her that her task was to find the mistakes. The girl looked at the size of the task in surprise and asked if she had to check them all. Jeffrey smiled and said that if she did a good job, he would make her a chocolate dessert tomorrow. Irene decided not to miss the opportunity to get closer to Jeffrey and enjoy a sweet treat at the same time. Irene hoped that she would be able to earn the scientist's trust if she became well-versed in the magical science, and she decided to devote her entire life to it. Irene planned that when her relationship with Jeffrey became as close as possible, she would hint that he adopt her and that she would eventually become a legitimate member of the Bruneau family. Once her perfect plan came to fruition, Irene would have nothing left to do but live the rest of her life in luxury and wealth, denying herself nothing. The girl was so happy that she didn't notice Avalon and Baymel appearing on the road. With their arms crossed over their chests, they asked in surprise what this little brat was doing at the main estate. Irene looked at the boys and realized that they were Harvinick's sons, who were quite spoiled and cruel, so she decided not to get into a conflict with them and just keep quiet. But the boys waited for an answer and asked why she was silent. Then the girl decided that she was the direct heir to Bruneau and boldly replied that she was busy at the moment, so she would have to continue their conversation later. After this statement, the boys were surprised because they did not expect Irene to dare to speak to them so boldly. Baymel asked in surprise if she had really lost her mind. Harvinick's eldest son approached the girl and poked her in the forehead with his finger, asking if she had forgotten who was the outsider in this house and why the hell she dared to open her mouth to them. But Irene looked him straight in the eye, and the boy asked in surprise why she wasn't crying today. Her younger brother also asked the girl what she was staring at, not understanding why she was behaving this way. Irene, plucking up her courage, shouted loudly that she was not an outsider in this house, but just as much a direct heir as they were. Therefore, if they insulted her, she would call them brats who wet themselves at night. The boys couldn't understand how she had figured that out. The girl remembered a conversation her mother had had in her past life when she didn't know who to share this problem with, so she told her secretary about it. Irene advised her not to mess with her, and she would keep it a secret. The girl added that she was their younger sister, and they shouldn't make fun of her and treat her as if she didn't belong to the Bruneau family. But Avalon shouted that he wouldn't dream of obeying her just because she knew their weakness and that she was no sister to them. Her younger brother shouted that they would never forgive her. Irene decided it was better not to get involved in the conflict and simply avoid these arrogant boys in the future. So she turned around and decided to quietly walk away before they started fighting. Avalon quickly caught up with the girl and blocked her way, asking who had allowed her to leave, since they hadn't finished talking yet. Then the boy boastfully advised her to take the path of an outsider. Irene didn't know how to avoid this conflict, so she decided to settle things first and asked what would happen if she didn't want to walk that way. Avalon replied that in that case, she wouldn't be able to leave. Irene looked him boldly in the eyes and asked why she should take any path at all when she was just going about her business, and advised him to get lost while she was still in a good mood. The boys looked at each other, realizing that Irene was not behaving as she usually did. The girl boldly said that if they didn't let her go, she would tell the Duke everything. But before the girl could finish her sentence, Avalon, enraged, grabbed her by the hair and started yelling at her, asking her what the hell she was doing threatening him. The boy had already lost control, so he started yelling that she was nobody here and shouldn't behave so insolently in their presence because they could immediately show her her place. The boy yelled that their grandfather had no business with this brat and wouldn't even notice if she disappeared from their estate. Then Irene clutched her book tighter and hit Avalon hard on the forehead. While Avalon wiped the blood from his forehead, the girl shouted that she would rather be a complete orphan than be a scumbag like them. Irene advised him not to come near her again if he didn't want another beating. The younger brother looked fearfully at the angry girl waving the book, not letting his brothers near her, and said that Irene had completely lost her mind and advised his brother to get away. But Avalon, wiping the blood from his forehead, shouted that he would not allow some nobody to treat them like that. Suddenly, the boy grabbed Irene by the collar and dragged her into his father's office. Meanwhile, Harvinick was looking through important papers in his office. Suddenly, the door flew open and his sons rushed in, dragging Irene with them, who was trying to break free. The boys began to tell their father that this brat had attacked and beaten them. And because of this, they demanded that Harvinick punish the girl fairly. Irritated, Harvinick looked up and stared at the girl who had been causing him so much trouble lately. Feeling his gaze, Irene felt uncomfortable. When their father asked his sons what had happened, Avalon began to tell him that they had simply asked Irene what she was doing on the main estate, to which she had called them brats who wet their beds at night. The younger son added that after all this, Irene, as if mad, grabbed her book and hit Avalon in the face. Irene, meanwhile, couldn't believe that they could lie so brazenly. Avalon shouted that she was trying to show her true colors, having grown up without parents, and pushing the girl forward, asked his father to teach her good manners. The father was naturally displeased that his eldest son had been beaten by a girl younger than him, so he approached Irene and asked her why she would not apologize to his sons for her behavior. The boys looked at each other with satisfaction, and a sly smile appeared on their faces, because they knew that their father would force this insolent girl to apologize. Irene, meanwhile, did not understand what she was supposed to apologize for. Irene indignantly wondered why on earth she should apologize for being called all sorts of offensive names and then beaten up. So she stubbornly remained silent, not daring to look up at Harvinick. Harvinick began to rage and asked in surprise if she was going to ignore his request and continue to remain silent. He shouted at her, demanding that she immediately kneel down and apologize to his sons. Irene tried to explain that it was Avalon who had started the fight, but Harvinick didn't even want to hear it. He grabbed the girl's arms painfully and ordered her to shut up and do as he demanded. The girl met Harvinick's gaze, and a chill ran down her spine, for she remembered that look from her past life and knew that he would not let her go until she knelt down. And when the girl finally decided to comply with Harvinick's request, she heard a familiar voice asking what crime the girl had committed to deserve such humiliation. Irene wondered why Jeffrey was in this room. Meanwhile, Jeffrey approached the frightened girl, put his hand on her head, and told her not to worry. Harvinick, with his arms folded, looked at his younger brother and asked why he was interfering in how he was raising this girl. Jeffrey asked in surprise if anyone present had been seriously injured. But Harvinick indignantly exclaimed that the degree of physical injury was completely irrelevant, because the very fact that this ill-mannered girl had raised her hand against his son was simply unacceptable. Irene began to tremble with fear, and Jeffrey, sensing this, touched her hand, and she realized that she need not worry for her safety. Harvinick, meanwhile, continued to rage. Harvinick tried to explain to Jeffrey that this girl had caused a complete commotion here. He would not forgive anyone who raised a hand against a legitimate representative of the Bruno family. But Jeffrey replied sharply that a boy who pulls a girl younger than himself by her hair and calls her names is not worthy of bearing the Brunua family name. Harvinick began to shout that this could not be true, and that Jeffrey had to see the children's fight with his own eyes to make such a claim. Jeffrey replied that there was no doubt about the truth of his words. Then Jeffrey replied sharply that they had no time for all these pointless arguments because they had urgent business to attend to, and telling Irene to follow him, he left Harvinick's office. In his laboratory, Jeffrey immediately provided medical assistance to the girl, treating all her wounds. He asked how she was feeling. The girl assured him that she was fine. Jeffrey advised the girl to be more cautious in the future and not to get involved in conflicts with Harvinick's sons. Although he noted aloud that after this incident, they were unlikely to bother her in the near future. Then, Jeffrey smiled and said that these boys who peed their pants wouldn't dare bother her. From his words, Irene understood that he must have witnessed their conflict in the hallway. Jeffrey looked Irene in the eyes and said that he would turn a blind eye this time because he was the one who found her. But if something like this happened to her again in the future, she should be sure to let him know. Irene felt ashamed of her behavior towards Jeffrey and apologized, promising that next time he wouldn't have to get her out of such unpleasant situations. Jeffrey said that she hadn't done anything wrong today, so she shouldn't apologize when she wasn't to blame. Irene looked at Jeffrey gratefully and promised to take his advice. Then the man handed the girl the book he had given her to read that morning and said he had found it in the hallway. Irene took the encyclopedia on magic and thanked him for his thoughtfulness. Until today, Irene had believed that all the members of the Bruno family were on one side and she was on the other. But now the girl understood that Jeffrey had stood up for her without fear of the angry Harvinick. When Irene returned to her room, the maid asked in surprise what had happened to her face and why all her clothes were stretched out. She was simply shocked when she saw the young lady in such a state. The girl thought it would be a disaster if she told Mary the truth, and rumors began to spread throughout the estate. So she replied that she had simply fallen and injured herself. But the maid noticed that the girl looked as if she had been in a fight, and, concerned, asked if Jeffrey had done it. Irene hastened to assure her that Jeffrey had only given her first aid. The maid took the little girl's hands in hers and assured her that she would always be on her side. So she asked Irene to tell her the whole truth about what had happened to her. Irene looked at the maid and realized that she really wanted to help the girl. Still, she decided to respond that she had simply fallen down the stairs, and that was why she had these injuries. Mary looked at the girl in surprise and said sincerely that after Irene had recovered from her fever, she had become a completely different person. Irene understood what Mary meant. After her transformation, the girl thought only about how to stay alive and did not even think about how Irene usually behaved. So, of course, the maid could not recognize her. While the girl was thinking, Mary said that she liked Irene even more this way, but asked her to promise not to hide the truth from her, especially when she was hurting. Irene unfolded the drawing she had found in the trash and wondered how Jeffrey could have thrown away such valuable papers, since these magical tools would be released for sale in 10 years. These tools would be indispensable in the future, but for now, it was difficult to find the materials needed to make them, so Jeffrey threw them away, and Irene asked to take the drawings for herself. 3 days ago, Jeffrey unexpectedly left for the Imperial Palace. Irene knew from her past life that he would be very busy after his return. She was alarmed that this trip took place much earlier than expected. Irene decided to patent the magical devices right now. The demand for them was expected to skyrocket in the near future. Planning to make a fortune from this, she hoped to create a backup plan for herself. Irene wondered how a 7-year-old child could gather these expensive materials for magical instruments, make them, and distribute them in the near future. While thinking about how to bring her idea to life, Irene heard footsteps approaching from behind her. The girl turned around and saw Duke Bruno standing in front of her, accompanied by his butler. The Duke asked her what she was doing there. Irene greeted her grandfather and began to think about how to answer him. From her past life, she remembered the Duke as frail, but now he looked quite well. The Duke asked her angrily why she wasn't answering his question, and Irene stammered that she was Jeffrey's assistant, and that was why she was in his laboratory. The man then asked where Jeffrey was. The girl told him that he had left for the Imperial Palace 3 days ago and was not at the estate at the moment. Hearing this, the Duke shouted that his son was wasting his life in the laboratory and asked the girl to tell him that if he continued in the same vein, the Duke would kick him out of the estate immediately. Irene was surprised why the Duke was so negative about Jeffrey's magical experiments, since he was on the verge of a scientific breakthrough. The Duke said that, for starters, he would take away Jeffrey's laboratory. Irene understood that this could not be allowed to happen, because all their developments would come to an end. So she gathered her courage and shouted to her grandfather that this could not be done under any circumstances. The butler approached the Duke and reported that everything was ready. But Duke Raphael asked him to wait a moment and asked Irene what she meant by saying that Jeffrey's laboratory could not be taken away. Noticing that the Duke was interested in her message, Irene said that as Jeffrey's assistant, she could assure him that when the experiments were completed, they would be of incredible help to the entire empire. The girl thought that the Duke had no idea how huge the profits from Elfram would be. It would bring in so much money that it could support 3 generations of the Bruno family. Irene confidently said that Jeffrey would soon earn enough money through his magical research and would not have to ask the Duke for funds for his experiments. The Duke asked the girl where she had gotten this information. Irene replied that Jeffrey himself had told her. The Duke asked in surprise if a man who was trying to live like a madman could say such a thing. Raphael warned that if the girl tried to deceive him, she would get into trouble. Then he asked what she was doing there. Irene explained that she was finding mistakes in calculations. The Duke approached the table and began to shift the sheets of paper on which complex mathematical formulas were written and asked if the girl really calculated all this in her head. The assistant smiled and said that he didn't really understand the equations used in magic, so he was amazed that the girl could simply read them. Then the assistant added that he couldn't believe that a 7-year-old girl could calculate these complex equations in her head. Irene was pleased that the men had noticed her genius. The Duke looked over the mathematical formulas and said that they were quite complicated even for him, and asked if it was really Jeffrey who had taught her to make such accurate calculations. Irene admitted that she had learned to calculate mathematical formulas on her own, and that Jeffrey had taught her the laws of magical science. The Duke then showed her a drawing of magical instruments and asked what they were. Irene said that Jeffrey had allowed her to use the drawings as she saw fit, and the Duke asked if the drawings were the result of Irene's experiments. The girl admitted that the drawings were not the subject of her experiments, and the Duke asked if she was trying to study them. Irene replied again that she was not. The Duke then asked what she was going to do with them. Irene plucked up her courage and said clearly that she planned to create and sell the magical instruments depicted in the drawings. The Duke smiled and asked what she was talking about. The girl confidently said that the items depicted in these drawings might seem unusual now, but in the future, everyone would want to buy them, and even the Duke himself would not refuse one. The Duke looked at the girl with interest. A special gleam appeared in his eyes. He asked her if she was sure that every inhabitant of the empire would want to buy such an item. The man asked the girl if she was sure that such magical items would sell well and began to calculate the profits in his mind. The girl assured him that they would. She began to explain that even if funding for research was cut after the annual meeting, these magical items could be made independently. The Duke stood up abruptly, and the girl became nervous, wondering why he was leaving when she had only just begun to explain. Raphael said that if what she said was true, then there would be no problem with funding. The men exchanged glances and headed for the exit. Irene tried to explain the benefits of the experiments, but the Duke said he had heard enough and advised Irene not to sit there alone, but to go to her room. Left alone in the laboratory, Irene couldn't understand what she had said wrong and blamed herself for making the situation worse. She was sure that the Duke had come here with a decision already made. The Duke strode confidently through the corridors. An assistant who was trying to catch up with him asked His Highness if he wasn't going to close the laboratory today. The Duke said that was the plan, but that they would have to postpone the decision until the annual meeting. The assistant then asked what would happen to Jeffrey, and the angry Duke told him not to mention that scoundrel again. The Duke thought about the little girl who was much smarter than her peers and had great potential. He remembered that on the day she first arrived at the estate, the girl did not say a word. Then the assistant said that perhaps Jeffrey had managed to discover Irene's talent. And the Duke nervously replied again that his younger son couldn't figure out his own life, let alone discover anything new. The assistant said that perhaps the young lady's true nature was showing, as children quickly adapt to new environments, and asked the Duke what he thought about Irene receiving an education. The assistant added that supporting and educating talented children was something the Brunoy family was known for, and in this case, he believed that Irene's abilities were perfectly suited to this motto. The assistant thought that the girl was still too young to be tested on her ability to make things and sell them at a good price. But the Duke replied that he did not believe that a child was capable of such a thing. The Duke added that he did not even expect any success in this matter, but simply consoled himself with the hope that when Jeffrey heard about it, he would pull himself together and stop doing God knows what. But Raphael did not even expect that one day all his doubts about the drawings he had seen in Jeffrey's laboratory would be dispelled when Irene came to him with her calculations. Duke Raphael usually divided his free time between his estate in the imperial capital and his castle. But this time, he stayed at the castle for quite a long time, probably because he was preparing for the annual meeting. The entire Brunoy family gathered at the annual meeting to present their achievements and make important decisions. It was a grand event. It was held 3 days a year and had considerable authority and influence. The decisions made during the meeting were strictly regulated, and it took a whole year to change them, so none of the Brunos ever missed this meeting. In the past, during the annual meeting, the girl usually stayed up all night. The reports presented by Harvinick always focused solely on the profits that were to be made immediately. Harvinick was never interested in a business that was focused on the future. Therefore, when things went badly, he paid several times more to carefully hide everything. Compared to this hell, working with Jeffrey seemed like a fairy tale. Irene was worried that at this year's meeting, it would be announced that Harvinick would adopt her and that funding for Jeffrey's research would be cut off. In that case, a terrible future would be inevitable. In her past life, there had been no talk of terminating Jeffrey's research. But circumstances were somewhat different this time, so she couldn't sit idly by and decided to take preemptive action. Although Irene was very nervous, she told herself to calm down and knocked on the Duke's door. She knew that Raphael had supported Brunoy all his life, and as the head of the family, this proposal would attract his attention. When there was a knock at the door, the servant opened it and was very surprised to see a little girl standing there holding a notebook. A woman approached the man and remarked that the young lady looked quite attractive today. They asked the girl what had happened and why she had decided to disturb the Duke during his meeting. A large crowd gathered around the girl and began to discuss how much Irene resembled her late father. Meanwhile, the girl thought that the Duke trusted his close associates very much. The girl decided that if she made a good impression on the local aristocrats, it might be even more effective than impressing the Duke himself. So Irene smiled and greeted the adults. And while the aristocrats admired the young lady's good manners and behavior, she noticed a fair-haired man among those present whom she knew well from her past life and thought he looked quite handsome. This man's name was Vicomte d'Huys. Turning to him, Irene said that she would like to see her grandfather. After this statement, the young man looked at the girl in surprise. Vicomte looked closely at Irene and, seeing a notebook in her hand, expressed his hope that she had brought her drawings to show her grandfather. One man remarked that perhaps the girl had written a letter to their Duke, noting that the notebook was quite thick. And while the adults speculated about what Irene had prepared, she felt uncomfortable. Vicomte noticed that the girl was blushing and asked those present not to speculate so wildly in the presence of a young lady, as they might frighten her. After this remark, the discussion stopped abruptly. Vicomte d'Huys suggested that Irene follow him, noting that the Duke was in another office. When the door opened, he informed His Grace that a young lady had come to see him. Irene was very worried that she had come during a meeting, and the Duke, looking at his granddaughter in surprise, asked what had brought her to him. Raphael did not like being distracted from his meeting. The girl lowered her head and greeted her grandfather. She did not dare to look him in the eye because she was very afraid of angering the Duke. Meanwhile, someone present informed him that Irene wanted to give him something. Vicomte informed His Highness that the girl had been very eager to see the Duke at the end of the meeting and was therefore very nervous. Raphael told Irene to come closer to him. The girl timidly approached His Highness, wondering why all these aristocrats were not leaving. When Raphael asked her what she had brought him, Irene said she wanted to show him something. The Duke also noticed that Irene did not dare to look him in the eye and thought that this was not surprising. Since the last time she had seen him, he had been very angry with Geoffrey. One of the women helped the girl sit down on a chair, and Irene immediately handed her notes to her grandfather. Raphael asked if he should look at them now, and the girl timidly nodded. The Duke was surrounded by aristocrats who were also trying to peek at the notebook, but Raphael sternly asked if they had nothing better to do. Those present immediately left His Highness's office. Only Vicomte remained in the office. The Duke looked at him, and the man hastened to say that he had to stay a little longer because an important thought had just occurred to him. Vicomte stood behind the Duke and kept his eyes on the little girl's notes. Raphael also looked closely at the notes. Irene noticed that he was not so serious, even when reading secret documents. Vicomte also noticed the excessive seriousness of His Highness and thought that perhaps the young lady had written something threatening in her letter. But suddenly, Raphael began to laugh loudly and couldn't stop. Tears welled up in the Duke's eyes from laughter, and he began to wipe them away. Vicomte became agitated and asked if he could also look at Irene's notes, and the Duke handed him the notebook. The notes contained Irene's request to turn these drawings into magical products and sell them at a profit. She offered to give all the profits to her grandfather in exchange for funding for Geoffrey's laboratory. Vicomte noted that this was not some sweet note from a granddaughter, but a more mature business proposal. And they were trying to force the head of a trading empire, Raphael, to cooperate with the help of a child's letter. The notebook went on to say that the page could only be turned if the Duke agreed to the terms of cooperation, as the following pages contained important information. Although Vicomte was very curious to see what was written next, he did not dare to turn the notebook over and handed it to the Duke. The man noted that the proposal, written in colored pencils, was very well written. The Duke looked curiously at the little girl sitting opposite him and asked what would happen if they suffered losses. But Irene confidently assured His Highness that he would not be at a loss. Irene noted that even if the goods did not sell, they could be dismantled and the magic stones reused, as this was possible with Jeffrey's formula. Raphael then inquired about the initial costs. Irene assured him that they would be no more than the cost of research funds. The Duke thought to himself that the child was consciously entering into a business deal. As if reading her grandfather's thoughts, Irene pointed out that it was actually a mutually beneficial agreement for everyone. The only condition was not to stop funding the research laboratory and not to fire Jeffrey. The Duke couldn't take his eyes off Irene, trying to understand what was so unique about this girl. He asked her again if she was really sure that if they didn't succeed, they would still break even. Then the Duke asked Vicomte if they had any magic stones left that they could use to make tools. After thinking about it, Vicomte said that they had enough for about 50 samples. Then Raphael looked at Irene and asked if she wanted to try to bring her proposal to life using these magic stones. At first, the girl couldn't believe what she had heard from the Duke. But then, when it dawned on her, Irene happily asked if the Duke had really decided to try. Vicomte couldn't believe his ears and asked His Highness what he meant. Raphael calmly told him not to interrupt him until he had finished expressing his opinion. He began to look again at the drawings his granddaughter had brought him. Laying all the drawings on the table, he asked Irene which one she would like to try to bring to life first. Without hesitation, the girl pointed to the first drawing. Looking at the drawing again, the Duke said that they would start by making a prototype and that he would assign one of the scientists to help Irene with the design. Then Raphael turned to Vicomte and said that as soon as the magical tool was made, he should help distribute it. Since there would be about 50 of them, they could be displayed in Juan's shop. Vicomte did not like to argue with dukes, so he said that in principle it would be possible. But first, he needed to know what exactly he would be selling. Then the Duke smiled and said that it would be a product that would be unusual now, but in the future, everyone would want it, including the Duke himself. He looked at Irene, asking if he had heard her correctly. Irene began to smile happily and remembered how she had said those words to him. Then Raphael told his granddaughter that they would try to bring her idea to life, noting that he would eagerly await the results. The little girl's eyes lit up with happiness, and she assured Duke Brunoy that she would do everything possible and impossible to keep His Highness satisfied. All the way home after her conversation with the Duke, the girl ran, feeling like she was on cloud 9, and couldn't stop thinking about how lucky she was to have made such a great deal with the head of the Brunoy family. Irene was glad that even if she did not make any profit from the sale of the magical instruments, she would be able to continue funding Jeffrey's research laboratory and keep him at the estate. Before Jeffrey returned, she decided to quickly review all the journals he had left her and then focus on making the first products at the end of the week. Looking through Jeffrey's notes, the girl noticed that she was doing the same thing she had done yesterday, but today, everything was going much faster and easier, so she decided it was because of her successful deal. She understood that the decision to adopt her had not yet been made. And although Raphael also emphasized that he would be watching her, Irene felt that things had already improved significantly. A woman unexpectedly entered the laboratory and called for the little lady. Surprised, Irene approached the stranger and said that she was here. The rather pretty woman introduced herself as Alphona and said she was the Bruno family librarian. She said she had seen Irene in the library before, but hadn't had a chance to meet her. Irene noted that this was not the librarian she knew from her previous life and thought that Alphona must have quit before she was hired. Irene smiled and greeted the young woman, saying she was pleased to meet her. But in reality, the girl was more interested in why the librarian was looking for her. Irene hastened to point out that Jeffrey was not there at the moment. But Alphonia replied that she was not looking for him. She said that she had brought some books from the library to the laboratory that Jeffrey had requested. The girl looked in surprise at the two-story table on wheels and noted that it contained almost half the library. Meanwhile, Alphona noticed that she had a message for the young lady from Jeffrey. Alphona raised her index finger, as Jeffrey had done, and changing her voice, said sternly that this time he was not lending the books to the girl, but giving them to her, and if she did not want to read them, she could put them aside for later. Seeing the number of books, Irene's eyes widened, and she thought it would be quite rude to put such a pile of books aside for later, considering how much Jeffrey had spent on them. After thinking for a moment, Irene came to the conclusion that Jeffrey probably didn't want the old books to remind her of the incident that had happened with Harvinick's sons, and had decided that the girl should study new literature. Returning from the street, completely soaked, Jeffrey undressed and threw his clothes on the bed. He noted that the best Imperial laboratory was not as good as rumored. Jeffrey resignedly admitted that after all the careful experiments they had conducted, the only thing they could do was find out that it was just a prototype of the material they needed. And it was more like someone's evil joke. Jeffrey didn't want to admit that it was a futile attempt, because trying to determine the composition from burnt traces was an impossible task, and all the Imperial scientists had tried to prove it. Jeffrey was so tired that he sat down in a chair and said loudly that they had to figure this out no matter what, because even a 7-year-old child could see the mistakes in the formulas. The man remembered Irene, thanks to whom their research, which had been at a standstill for several months, had finally moved forward. And the girl talked about it with an expression on her face as if nothing had happened. Jeffrey began to think that despite her intelligence, the girl always looked sad, and he decided that it would be a good idea to send her to an academy to get a proper education. Then the scientist caught himself thinking that the girl was still too young for the academy, as there might be age restrictions. In that case, he decided to take it upon himself to educate her. Thinking about little Irene, he imagined how nice it would be to have a daughter like this clever girl, and what scientific inventions they could make with her intelligence. After returning from Duke Raphael's office, Irene had completed the same amount of work in the last 2 weeks as she had in her previous life, so she had almost no time to rest. The girl noted that she had completed almost all the journaling tasks that Jeffrey had entrusted to her, and if she finished reading the next book before his return, she would be a real genius. The maid was concerned that the young lady was spending so much time with her books, so she remarked disapprovingly that Irene had promised her today that she would rest in the fresh air, not read books in her room. The maid added that children grow better when they breathe fresh air, and that since her fever, the girl had not once taken a walk in the local garden, so today was the best day for it. The girl thought that she was only 7 years old, and it would be even worse if she got sick again, so she took the advice and went out into the yard. Smelling the flowers, the girl was glad that she had gone out for a walk after all. Walking along the garden path, Irene heard a familiar voice, so she stopped and, hiding behind a column, saw a woman talking to an unknown man in the gazebo. Irene immediately recognized the voice of Saria Brunua, Harvinick's wife, who remarked that if her sons did not get into the academy this year, she would fall out of favor with the Duke. When the man said that he understood her problem perfectly, Saria immediately took out a thick wallet filled with coins and placed it in his hands. The man did not refuse and quickly hid the bribe. Irene kept her eyes on Saria and the unfamiliar man, and heard the woman add that when her son's admission was finalized, the man would receive the rest of the reward, as they had agreed. Saria sternly asked if her sons would really be admitted to the academy no matter what, and the man smiled and said that it had already been decided, even regardless of the results of the entrance exams. The man added that Saria could consider her son's students of the best imperial academy, and the woman smiled and replied that she was glad to hear it. The girl was so surprised by what she heard that she stumbled and fell. Hitting her knees, Irene felt pain and cried out, attracting the attention of Saria and her companion. Saria immediately realized that they were not alone, so she thanked the man for her children's well-being, and he added that it was all thanks to their abilities, as he had done nothing. Saria quickly approached the girl, who had not yet managed to get up from the ground, and pointed out that one should greet one's elders. However, Irene did not even notice how Saria had appeared beside her. Irene quickly rectified the situation and greeted Harvanik's wife, who immediately asked how long the girl had been there. Irene said that she had been watching a butterfly and didn't notice when she fell. Hearing this, Saria breathed a sigh of relief and said that the girl was free to go. Irene hurried away as far as she could, thinking that Harvanik's sons had entered the academy through bribery. Irene guessed that this man was probably Hilbur and that he was the Bruneau family's tutor. She couldn't believe that he had helped Avalon and Bimel with their illegal admission to the Imperial Academy. The girl noted that it would be nice to have a magical tool with which she could record Saria's conversation, but Irene decided to remember all the details and use them when the opportunity arose. Completely immersed in her thoughts, Irene didn't even notice when the butler Balter approached her and greeted the young lady. The girl happily approached the respectable man. Balter bowed in greeting to Irene and informed her that he had come to escort the young lady to the Duke's office, as he had invited his granddaughter for an audience. Upon entering Raphael's office, Irene immediately ran to greet her grandfather. His Highness smiled in response and told the girl to come closer. Raphael immediately got down to business and told Irene that he had invited her to his office to test a magical device made according to her drawings. The Duke immediately handed the girl a portable hairdryer, informing her that they had finished its prototype today and asking Irene if she wanted to try it out. Looking at the new design, Irene noticed that it was a device for drying hair. The essence of the hairdryer was already known to people, so it would not be particularly new to the public. Pressing the button on the magical device, Irene thought that compared to existing hairdryers, the real value of this device was that it could be used for a long time. The Duke informed Irene that the first 50 hairdryers that were manufactured were sold out within hours of being displayed in Juan's shop. The girl was very surprised and delighted by this news, emphasizing that the hairdryer could automatically regulate the temperature to prevent overheating. The Duke said that aristocratic women were lining up in huge queues to place orders. Raphael said that he had never seen Vicomte so inspired during a conversation, and Irene noted that it was the hairdryer she wanted to try to make first because she knew its advantages. The hot air machines used at the time were large. The processes of heating and cooling the air were so complex that careless use could burn all the hair. The magic hairdryer, which was made according to Jeffrey's design, allowed the desired temperature to be set and was easy to use. It was the first product to gain popularity among users. Raphael noted that he did not expect his granddaughter to have such a talent for sales, and although he called it a preliminary test, everything had long been sold out, and it was most likely the final tally. Then his superior turned to Irene and asked what she thought about releasing a few more batches of these magical tools for sale, and the girl happily replied that it was a brilliant idea. Irene kept her eyes on the satisfied faces of the Duke and his butler and noted that this meant only one thing. The plan to close Jeffrey's laboratory during the annual meeting would be canceled. The Duke sipped his tea contentedly, while the girl thought that Raphael should not interfere with Jeffrey, who should be allowed to continue his experiments in peace and worry about the girl when she was adopted. Irene examined the magical device and marveled at the beautiful design. The Duke suddenly apologized to his granddaughter for being so inattentive to her earlier. His Highness placed his hand on her shoulder and remarked that he should have told her this when they first met, and asked if she could forgive him for his behavior. To say that Irene was surprised would be an understatement. She smiled and replied that everything was fine, and that she was just happy to be able to talk to her grandfather so calmly. Then the butler smiled and said that the old man wanted to offer Irene the opportunity to study, both as an apology and as a reward for her intelligence. Irene shook her head and muttered that she was already studying on her own. To herself, she noted that she would like something more material than the opportunity to study, which she already had enough of. But Balter remarked that His Highness wanted to provide the girl with systematic education so that she could further improve her knowledge and skills. The girl wondered how to express her desire to receive a percentage of the profits from her inventions. Suddenly, a man entered the office and asked if the Duke had summoned him. When Irene turned around, she saw Hilbur, whom she had recently caught taking a bribe, standing in the doorway. But the man smiled and greeted everyone present. Hilbur expressed his hope that he had not kept them waiting long, and the Duke replied that the man had arrived just in time, inviting Hilbur to come closer and sit down next to him. When Hilbur saw Irene, he turned pale, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. The girl guessed that the man probably thought she had told him about his conversation with Saria, but unfortunately, she did not have enough evidence. The Duke pointed to his granddaughter and said that she was the girl he had told Hilbur about earlier, adding that he would be entrusted with developing her potential. Raphael remarked that although she was young, she showed great promise. Hilbur said that he had no doubt about that, and the Duke then turned to the little girl and asked her to introduce herself, mentioning the name of her new teacher. His Highness told Irene that Hilbur would guide her in various areas of study until her path was firmly established, and she could completely trust this talented teacher. The prospect of studying with a bribe taker did not please Irene, of course, but she did not dare to contradict the Duke, so the girl bowed and told her new teacher her name. Hilbur smiled faintly and said that there was no need to show how talented the girl was in etiquette lessons. So he praised the Duke of Brunno's granddaughter for her exquisite manners. The butler also noted that the young lady could do well at the Training Institute and soon enter the Royal Academy as the best student. Hilbert smiled and said that the day when the Duke's granddaughter would become the best student was not far off. And the Duke, smiling, said that he would be happy to attend the ceremony for the best student. That evening, when Geoffrey returned, Irene thought that her plans to enroll as the best student could be forgotten if Harvinick adopted her, and she died soon. Geoffrey looked with surprise at his journals, which were in perfect order, and said that he did not expect the girl to be able to tidy them up. She remarked that she found the task enjoyable and had completed it quickly. The girl also happily reported that she had finished all the books he had given her the day before and would continue to study the new books that Geoffrey had given her through the librarian. Geoffrey was very pleased with the little girl's attitude and praised her, but Irene caught herself thinking that from now on, she would not be able to go to the science lab as often. The scientist noticed with his keen eye that something was bothering the girl. Meanwhile, she was wondering whether she should tell Geoffrey that from now on, they would see each other much less often because of her studies. At first, Irene thought not to upset Geoffrey, but then she realized that it would be much worse if she simply didn't come to see him without a good reason. So she told Geoffrey about the Duke's plans for her education. When he heard this, Geoffrey went berserk. He immediately rushed to the Duke's office, kicked the door open, and shouted, asking why the hell Raphael had taken his assistant away and sent her to school. The Duke, meanwhile, was sorting through some important papers and discussing the latest events with his butler. So he immediately jumped up from behind his desk and shouted for the pompous fool to leave his office immediately. The Duke was about to scold his son, but then he saw Irene come out from behind him, looking frightened at her grandfather. So Raphael fell silent, not daring to scare the girl even more. In a calmer tone, the Duke remarked that Jeffrey needed to learn good manners. But the scientist remarked that the only one who needed such lessons was his father. Jeffrey then asked his father why he had made a decision about his assistant without consulting him. Raphael replied that his decision was final. The child needed an education, not work. Jeffrey said that his father was talking as if he were locking his child in his laboratory and forcing her to work. But Raphael remembered the day he met Irene and thought that he had every reason to believe that. The Duke shouted that when the girl needed to run around and explore the world, Jeffrey locked her in a laboratory and forced her to work. And he had no intention of raising another good-for-nothing like Jeffrey in this mansion. Jeffrey swallowed his pride and said that he would take care of Irene's education and professional training himself, since he had already registered her as his official assistant. But the Duke sternly shouted that he had heard enough and was not going to continue to fulfill all of Jeffrey's whims, because he had already made his decision long ago. And when the Duke was about to continue, Jeffrey stopped him abruptly. Jeffrey shouted that he would not allow him to speak his decision. Meanwhile, Irene thought that she had followed Jeffrey to somehow resolve their conflict, but the situation had gotten completely out of control. Irene was worried that the Duke might just get angry and kick Jeffrey out of his estate immediately. And then all the girl's plans for her future father would go up in smoke. So Irene plucked up her courage and, interrupting the adults' conversation, asked if she couldn't do both. That is, be Jeffrey's assistant and study with Hilbert at the same time. Irene understood that she could not stop being Jeffrey's assistant because it was the only way she could see him. But she also could not pass up the chance to earn praise from the Duke. The girl understood that by refusing one person, she would lose contact with both of them forever. And she did not want that at all. Jeffrey said that he would take care of Irene's education and send her to the academy. The Duke did not let his son express his opinion and shouted that the girl should study with the Bruno family. Then Jeffrey also shouted that he knew what this girl was capable of in terms of education. The Duke shouted that he also had sufficient information about Irene's mental abilities and would decide on her education himself. Irene tried to say something, but both men shouted at her not to interfere. The butler understood that the men's emotions were running high and that the girl should not interfere while they were sorting out their relationship. So he leaned over to Irina and asked her permission to take her away for a moment. Meanwhile, the heated discussion reached its climax, and the Duke, banging his hand on the table, shouted that he was responsible for his granddaughter's future. Jeffrey had no intention of giving in to his father and shouted that he would take care of it himself. The tension between the men was so high that sparks flew. A few more minutes and they would have come to blows. But Irene, not knowing what to do, gave in to her emotions and burst into tears. The men immediately fell silent and looked at the little girl, who could not calm down and cried even louder. The Duke immediately apologized to his granddaughter. Jeffrey ran to his assistant and picked her up. He whispered in her ear that she had nothing to be afraid of and that they would go to their laboratory so she could calm down. The Duke did not argue and let his son go with Irene in his arms. Once in the laboratory, Jeffrey handed the girl a glass of water to help her calm down. Irene thought about how, ever since she was a child, she had found it difficult to control her emotions. She hadn't expected to cry so loudly at the sight of adults arguing. Jeffrey apologized for the girl witnessing their argument. And when Irene mentioned her grandfather, he said they would talk about it later and assured her that she was not to blame for the argument. Irene sat with her head down, staring at the floor. She was ashamed of her behavior and simply couldn't control her emotions at that moment. Meanwhile, Jeffrey said he had something for his assistant. The scientist took out a box. Irene thought that the only thing missing was for Jeffrey to start talking about the work he had brought from the Imperial Palace. But when she opened the box, she saw that it contained sweets from Eliza's pastry shop. The pastry shop was so popular that even the royal family could only order something by appointment. Jeffrey said he couldn't bring her more because he didn't have much time and advised her not to eat too many sweets at once. Irene had never seen such a variety of desserts in her life. The girl's mood immediately improved, and Jeffrey asked her to tell him what had happened while he was away. Irene asked if he would like to know about her grandfather, and he replied that he was interested in whether Harvinick had visited the laboratory. Irene didn't understand why he was interested in Harvinick and truthfully replied that his older brother hadn't been to the laboratory while he was away and asked why he was interested in that. Jeffrey replied that he had simply heard rumors that the Duke was creating a product using the blueprints Irene had taken. The girl then pointed out that he himself had said she could do whatever she wanted with them. Irene said that she had seen the blueprints and was curious to see how they would work in reality. She then told her grandfather about it, and he gladly offered to help her bring the idea to life. Jeffrey asked in surprise if it was Irene's idea and not the Duke's. The girl said that it was hers, of course, and that she also planned to use all the other drawings to make magical instruments. Jeffrey asked her sternly if she was sure that no one had encouraged her to do this. Irene said that she had advised him not to worry because she had registered all the patent rights for the products in Jeffrey's name. While Jeffrey was trying to figure out where she had learned about patent rights, the girl explained that even if they didn't see any money from the products now, it would bring them good profits in the future.